Good Father in heaven, we thank you for this day and for the many blessings that you continually bestow upon us. We're thankful for the night's rest and for the opportunity we have to come together to study your word. We pray that the things that Brace has prepared and will interact with the class will help to confirm things that we already believe and have faith in you. Pray you'll continue to be with our number who are unable to be out this morning. Pray that those things that are hindering them would be removed and they'd be able to enjoy the pleasure of fellowship with us. Continue to watch over and care for us. We ask it all in Jesus' name. Amen.
Well, if you didn't see, I put questions back there for our next topic of discussion, which is going to be the canonization of the Bible. And we'll focus probably predominantly on the New Testament, but really as a whole, I want you to think about what that means, what that doesn't mean, what that involved. And so I've got some questions that deal primarily with how we got the Bible in the first place, what the Bible is, and what that really means. I know we've talked about inspiration before, and we've talked about it even some in this particular study that we're doing now already. I want you to think about what that really means and what that says about what we have. And then I want you to think about some things that maybe you haven't thought about before, and there are some questions that deal with that. For example, there are some books that are mentioned in the New Testament and Old Testament alike that we don't have. And I want you to think about the ramifications of what that means with regard to this particular discussion. Does that mean those books were not inspired, but that the things that they said that are quoted are accurate and true? Were they inspired and we just don't have them? What does that mean? What does that not mean? And so I want you to just think about perhaps some things you haven't thought about before with regard to all of this. And that's going to kind of lay our groundwork. And then I want you to think about the process of how, especially the New Testament, came into the form that we have it today. Because we know it didn't just suddenly appear and that's what they had. And so we know that there were early on teachings that were done just the same way essentially that we do teaching today, where someone stands up in front of the building, the assembly, and teaches about things, except that in their case, the Holy Spirit was guiding those words as they were prophets and apostles. And then after that, after some years, there began to be writings that were recorded. And what happened, what would have happened with those? And I want you to think not only about some of the things that are said in the New Testament with regard to what was expected to happen, but just think about what you would do or what we would do as a church here if we got, for example, a letter from Paul, an inspired message from Paul that was guided by the Holy Spirit to tell us how we were supposed to act. What would we do with that kind of a letter besides just read it in the assembly and talk about what that means for us and what needed to change? So think about, just kind of try to put yourself back in the first century when all of that's going on. Realize what they had, what they didn't have, and then realize what you would have done with what you began to accumulate as those teachings came. I mean, we have a couple of letters to the Corinthians, for example, and so they began to have a little library that was just to them. And what would you do with that kind of library as you think about brethren in other places and all those kinds of things? So just try to put yourself back in that mindset and think about the historical context a little bit. And we'll talk about all of what that really involves and how what we have, which we are very blessed to have, and we should recognize that as we go through this whole discussion, how what we have came into being and has been preserved and passed down for us. I think it can be a really helpful study for us in thinking about the blessing that we have and how we ultimately have received it. So we'll head in that direction next. I'm not necessarily saying we're going to finish with this topic today, but we're getting close. So at least in my mind, unless there are lots of things you bring up. So we're getting close, and then we'll move on into that next discussion after that. So I just want to give you a little bit of background in those questions, and you can start working on that over the next few days, and that way you'll be prepared for the direction that we're going to go. So in this class, we've been talking a lot about the similarities between the Law of Moses and the Code of Hammurabi, and it's typically leveled as a criticism of the Bible, that Moses borrowed essentially from Hammurabi, and therefore what Moses recorded is not inspired, and people who believe that are just believing a lie and a myth and all that kind of stuff. And we've talked about the fact that it is true that there are similarities between the Code of Hammurabi and other ancient law systems and the Law of Moses. So we're not denying that. And we don't do ourselves any favors when we do deny it, because it's a fact. I mean, and so we're talking about we've talked about the difference between facts and interpretation of facts. The critics will interpret the facts to say, well, Moses borrowed from Hammurabi and therefore the Bible's not inspired and you all are just believing a myth and a lie. That's their interpretation. There is another interpretation, of course. But the facts remain the same. There are similarities between the two and between the Law of Moses and a lot of other ancient law systems as well. And we've talked about what some of those reasons might be for why those similarities exist. And we've also discussed some potential problems with some of the explanations that we've offered that might arise, some additional criticisms that might come because of that. And then on Wednesday, hopefully I'm not the only one who's thought of it, and that I didn't just throw a whole new piece of information at you that you're like, whoa. But hopefully between Wednesday and today, you've at least had a little bit of an opportunity to think about the fact that one of the other things that deserves attention in this whole discussion is the differences between the Law of Moses and the Code of Hammurabi and other ancient law systems, because they are vast. And so while the similarities are in some cases pretty glaring, and the language that's used seems almost verbatim if we were to translate from one language to another, the differences between the Law of Moses and any other law system that I'm aware of, and that's all I'll say, because I don't have every piece of evidence that's out there, and we don't even have necessarily every piece of evidence that might have existed or might exist. So there might be things that we find in the future. But from what I have seen, there is no other law system that contains the kinds of things that we find in the Law of Moses. And so I mentioned Wednesday that one direction we could go, which is not the direction I'm planning on going, is just to deal with the religious differences between the two. And all I mean by that is that predominantly ancient law systems are in a context of polytheism. And everybody knows what I mean when I say that, right? We know the difference between what is monotheistic and polytheistic. They're just fancy words. I don't know why it is that we as people think we've got to come up with fancy terminology to describe everything. It's the difference between believing in one God and believing in a lot of gods. Mono, one, poly, many. And so it's the difference between those two kinds of thoughts. And I'm not suggesting that there aren't any other ancient religious systems or even modern religious systems that I'm not suggesting that there are no others that believe in only one God, because there are others. I mean, for example, Islam today is a vast worldwide religious belief and movement that believes in one God. In fact, they would claim that they believe in the same God we do. They believe in the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. They would say Abraham, Ishmael, and Ishmael. But the point is, they would say they believe in the same God that we do. There are Jews who consider themselves Orthodox Jews. I say consider themselves because they're not really Orthodox Jews. To be Orthodox Jew, an Orthodox Jewish person would mean that you keep the law, and they don't keep the law. They can't keep the law. There is no temple. There is no priesthood, according to the order of Levi, that exists any longer, and there's no ability for them to follow the law as it is written, which is what was required. They were to do everything that was commanded to Moses that was written down in the law, and they can't do that. But they claim to, and they claim to worship the same God we do, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So they believe in monotheism. And there may be other ancient systems that believed in one God or sought to consolidate their worship to be toward one God. So I'm not suggesting that there are no other monotheistic systems, but it is unique and certainly is different than the Babylonians and the Akkadians and some of those other ancient systems that are usually called into comparison with the scriptures in the Bible. So we could go in that direction. We could talk about the nature of God himself, because typically in these ancient law systems, the gods that they worshiped were tied to creation in some way. And what I mean by that is something similar to what John shared with us, I think it was a couple weeks ago, when he was talking about God's judgments on Egypt and their gods. For example, there was a god of the Nile, and there was a god of the insects, and there was a god of the dirt, and there was a god of the sun, and there was a god of all those different things. And so essentially the gods in their minds were represented by various aspects of the created, the things that we see around us, the things that they could see, feel, touch, taste, smell, all that kind of stuff. The God of the Bible is what we, again, another fancy word we've come up with to describe him, transcendent. And that just means he's not tied to anything in the creation because he is the creator. He's made everything. And so he is outside of and beyond all that is created. He himself is the only thing that is uncreated, the only being that is uncreated, I guess would be a better way to put it than thing. He is the only one who is uncreated. And so he's not tied to the creation. We could go in that direction. We could talk about all those things. I've mentioned them just for grins, more or less. But that's not the direction I want to go, because I want to think about the actual law system itself and the ramifications of those laws. And so I want to see, first off, from your perspective, what are some differences that you see between the law system that is the law of Moses and the law system of Hammurabi or any of the other ancients that you might have looked at? What are some differences that exist within the natures of the laws themselves? Andrew's got something. I knew he wouldn't let me down.
Well, and this might be straying directly into what you just said you didn't want to focus on, but
Not necessarily.
in starting by looking at basically the preambles to both laws, because there is a preamble to the law, to the Code of Hammurabi. There's a whole intro section where it's all the names of Hammurabi and all the great things that he did. And then there's a whole portion that explains why the law was written. And the summary of it is kind of to bring about righteousness. I think it's to bring about righteousness in the land so that the strong should not harm the weak, or something like that. There's kind of a statement of why this law is written. But the motivations for a lot of these ancient law systems, they are purely civic law, and they identify themselves as such. So
Okay.
they're laws written by people, for people. And one of the key indicators of that is he stamped his name all over it, and he put his picture on it, and he made sure that everybody knew this was his law and that he gave it. And ancient kings could not resist putting their pictures and their names on everything that they built and everything that they carved in stone. They wanted it to be known that this was from them and that they were the lawgiver. And even though we call the law of Moses the law of Moses, he didn't stamp his name on the tablets of stone. He didn't put his picture on them. He didn't say, this is my law. The law of Moses is unique in that it identifies itself purely as a directly divinely given law.
Okay.
And that there really is no lawgiver in the law of Moses other than God himself.
Okay, and that's good. I mean, and it does, Andrew's right, it does somewhat run in the vein of what I said we weren't going to discuss, but it's not exactly the same thing. And so the difference between who is the originator of that law, and as Andrew said, Hammurabi's pretty clear. He wants everybody to know this is my law, that he has given for the well-being of his people, certainly, but it is his law. It was a law, as Andrew said at the beginning, given by men for men, whereas the law of Moses, and he's right, we refer to it that way. Why do we do that? That's exactly right. And I mean, and what else does? The Bible does. I mean, so, because I was going to say, if we're going to speak in Bible ways and call Bible things Bible names, then if the law of Moses is not right, then we shouldn't use it. But the Bible uses it. So we use it for that reason. But they understood, as Andrew said, and we understand that the reality is Moses didn't claim that it was his law. And when we say the law of Moses, we just mean the law given through Moses. But it was actually the law of God. In fact, those tablets of stone, not only did Moses not draw his picture on them or write his name on them, he didn't even write them. Who wrote them? According to Exodus, they were written by the finger of God, which again, going back to something Andrew said a week or two or three or whatever ago, is accommodative language. Does God really have fingers? I mean, he's a spiritual being. Does he look like us? I mean, I think sometimes we get the wrong idea. We think we're created in God's image. That means we look like him. If he wants to have fingers, he can have fingers. I mean, if he wants to have any other kind of appendage, he can. But he uses accommodative language like his fingers and his hands and his eyes and his heart and all those kinds of things. He uses that because why? Honestly, I mean, and this is again to the point of the way God deals with us. Why does he speak in those kinds of terms? We understand it. I mean, we all have hands and fingers and hearts and eyes and all those kinds of things. So God uses that language not because it inherently describes his being, but because they're things that we understand. I mean, could God speak to a tablet and have it carved out? We'd be foolish to say no. He spoke to nothing and created all of the things that we see. So yes, of course he could just speak to it, but he describes it as carving it with his own finger. And the point is, we understand what that means. We understand that kind of language, and that's how God speaks to us. Yes, sir.
So with the Hammurabi, which revision are you looking at?
I don't even know. I mean, it's a good question.
I mean, when you take a look at God's law, it doesn't change.
No.
From the time that Moses gave it to the time that it was done away with when Christ was crucified, well, even after that, really. It didn't change. And we take a look at, even today, how often do our laws change? And I'm sure the law of Hammurabi changed. I mean, when you take a look at kings, when you take a look at anything throughout history, laws changed depending on how a king felt, on this or that went. And I'm sure that the copy of the Hammurabi, I don't know if that revision 1 or the original, or I'm sure those laws changed throughout the time.
Well, the one that I'm looking at is the translated English text of a stone that was carved and etched. So, but Joe makes a good point. I mean, he makes a good point. This particular piece of stone, I don't know that it was altered again, but the reality is, with regard to the laws of men given by men, what happens to them? We modify them. How often they change, Greg? Depends on the legislative session, right? I mean, they're changed all the time. Why do we do that? I mean, I mean, sometimes it's because we don't like it. We look at a law and we say, that law is not fair, that law is not just, and we change it. But in other cases, Greg's right. There are instances where we write things because we're men, and we write things that we think are for the good of the people, and then later we figure out, you know what, that wasn't such a great idea. And so we modify it, and we change it. Sometimes we do. Sometimes we revert back to an older version of the law. Is there any reason for God to ever do that, though? Why? Why?
He's right.
Because he's right. He's timeless. Is there ever anything that comes up that surprises him? No. He's not surprised by any of the antics we've come up with and created throughout the history of our time here on this planet. He knows what's in our best interest, and he knows what's always in our best interest. So it doesn't need to be modified because somehow what was in our best interest 1,000 years ago is no longer in our best interest. So God doesn't need to modify his law. And so as Joe said, the law of God doesn't change with regard to man's dealings with man. And I think that's important for us to look at, because has God's law changed? Is there a difference between the law of Moses and the law of Christ? Generally speaking, is it a difference between the moral code between men and men? Generally speaking, is it an inherent difference between the code of God between man and God? Not generally. But there are differences in the things that God called on his people to do in worship in the Old Testament and the things that he calls on us to do in the New Testament. And so there are differences in that. So there are modifications in that way. Again, why do you think God might have done that?
It's different. I mean, there was a reason for the law.
Okay, so there's a difference in the inherent purpose behind those things. And did the Jews learn about God through that old law? Yes. Do we learn about God through that old law? Yes. Do we hopefully know God better now than we did before? Yes. So there's a whole process of learning as well, Greg. And then John.
Well, even God said, you know, in the beginning it was not so. Through the hardness of your heart, Moses gave the writ of divorce. And that's not to say that he didn't know our hearts would be hard the first day he wrote that down.
No.
I mean, there's no reason to believe that God didn't anticipate anything in terms of any differences or revisions, if that's not even the accurate word. But what it is a New Testament.
Right.
It is a new promise because it's new and improved.
Right.
But it all still hangs on the law and the prophets, in that everything foundational was laid down for the New Testament then to complete.
Yeah, and I mean, even going back to that whole passage Greg's talking about in Matthew 19 with regard to marriage, divorce, God says, because of the hardness of your hearts, and it's really interesting in that context, in looking at the different Gospels, the words that are used. One passage, one version says, because of the hardness of your hearts, Moses permitted you to give your wives a certificate of divorce. In another passage, in a different gospel, it actually uses the word that Moses commanded you to give your wives a certificate of divorce. And some people take that word command there and say, see, God was allowing them to divorce their wives. I would suggest that's not the case. This is my understanding of looking at all the passages that are being dealt with, which is those gospel accounts that we're talking about. In connection with Deuteronomy 24, I would suggest they were already putting their wives away, that it was a time period in which they were just finding something in their wife that displeased them and they sent her away. And then when they realized what a fool they were, they took her back again. And God is essentially, again, for the protection of the women and children in those situations, saying if you send her away, you're going to make it a legal pronouncement and give her a certificate of divorce so that someone else could take her and make her their wife under that system that they had, and she could be protected and provided for in the way that she needed to be. You're not just going to treat her like property, where you can cast her off and bring her back anytime you want to. You're going to deal with her in a legal way that's going to recognize ultimately her right to be provided and protected for by somebody else, and you're not going to do that with her. So that's my belief in looking at all those passages. And so it was never that God said, okay, you can put your wives away if you're going to be that hard-hearted. He's just saying, if you're going to act like this, here's how it's going to proceed. Here's how you're going to do it. John had something, and then we'll come back up here to Jim.
I was just going to say, to look at the Sermon on the Mount, that, when the Lord basically starts it with, you are the salt of the earth. And it's interesting to look at the sermon that he doesn't really talk about worship. He talks about the effect that they were going to have on others, as he talks about love and hatred. He talks about adultery. He talks about, and eventually he talks about, at one point, he quotes the eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. And then the following verse, he says, but I tell you, so he's laying it down, and you can tell there were things from the law they were not applying correctly. And there were things not within the law that they were also applying incorrectly, their own traditions and things like that. But to your question about, the differences between the Hammurabi and the law, I'm looking at it online back here, and it's interesting, the tooth for a tooth part of that, of the Hammurabi. It's interesting, this is, if a man knocks out the tooth of a man of his own rank, they shall knock out his tooth. So you have the tooth for a tooth. The very next one says, if he knocks out the tooth of a plebeian, he shall pay 1/3 mina of silver. So that right there tells you there's something different even within the passage that everybody refers to, the eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. You can tell within the Code of Hammurabi there was the class system, lawfully almost, where you have your own rank or you have plebeians, peasants. You have that class system. You don't see that in the law. Granted, you do have the priesthood, but you don't see that sort of, oh, you have your own rank, and then you have those underneath you, and then you have the whole class system being set up.
Agree with that to an extent. Were there some differences in the payments, so to speak, in certain instances between the people, for example, and slaves? There were differences in some of those instances. Did those differences extend to the point of an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, though, as best you can remember? If I took the life of a slave, what would be my payment? I mean, as far as I can tell, there was nothing in that separated. A man's life was a man's life. But in the instance of Hammurabi, we find some other differences. But John's getting to the point that I really want to make, and that is the nature of that law and what kind of justice it was actually seeking. And I think Andrew addressed it somewhat too in his comments. So we'll talk about that a little bit more in a moment. Jim.
Yeah, we talk about the law of Moses, the law of Moses. It reminds me of what Paul said, according to my gospel.
Right.
See, the law didn't belong to Moses, the gospel didn't belong to Paul, but those are the laws that God gave through two men to lead his people in the direction of eternal life.
That's right.
Promised land.
And they both knew it, right? I mean, neither one of them were unclear about that. Even though they used that terminology, or we use that terminology, neither one of them, nor are we, confused about what that really means and what it doesn't mean. We understand that those laws and that gospel originated with God, and that it was given through men as a tool and an instrument to share those things. And God, again, has done that throughout history, and I think that's going to keep that in mind, because that's going to be an important part of the discussion when we go forward in talking about canonization. Joe.
So when you take it's probably a lot of different nationalities and stuff like that in that area. The law of Moses was strictly if you had someone who was poor, I mean, they were still brothers to those who were rich.
Right.
And so they were supposed to treat each other correctly. And that's what the law was there for. I mean, it was for a particular group of people.
Yeah, and I mean, even though there might be some distinctions in, if an ox gored a person of the children of Israel versus if the ox gored a slave, some of those minor distinctions that were made, every life was considered to be important to God. And like I said, when we come to the eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth, I don't know that there are any distinctions that are made with regard to that. But there are still, within that law, some things that separate the Code of Hammurabi and the law of Moses, or the law of God. Yes.
Specific
There were-
stipulations on that because that servitude or that slave was still a brother.
And that's what I was going to, I think you're right. I think that the distinction, who typically was supposed to be the slaves or the servants who were serving Israel, the captives of war. It was supposed, there were certain nations they were to annihilate and destroy, but then there were other nations that were permitted to be their servants, and to serve, to continue to live in servitude beyond that. And so Joe's right. There may be in that law system and the way that it's described a distinction between how you treat a brother, even a brother who is a slave, versus how you would treat someone from a foreign nation that had been conquered. Yes, ma'am.
So the two main differences I see are the Code of Hammurabi really dealt a lot with possessions, and the Law of Moses really, from what I see, deals a lot with the moral laws of the people and then mercy, of God's mercy. Those are the two.
Okay, that's exactly right. So when you look at Hammurabi, primarily we're dealing with an economic justice. And really we might even talk about more of an equality. So for example, if I wrong you economically or if I harm you, then there were payments that were involved to make sure that you were compensated. That was one of the primary aims, seemingly, and the primary focuses for that law. Whereas, as Taylor points out, is that really the primary concern with God's law? There are laws that deal with, if I steal from a man, I repay him fourfold or fivefold, right? I mean, is that equality? If I steal from a guy and I repay him four or fivefold, is that equality? No, you did wrong, so now you're going to do what? You're going to give him more than he deserves, more than you took. So it's not really about equality. And more often than not, what is the focus? As Taylor said, it's the moral aspect of it, the proper treatment of people, and the right relationship that we're supposed to have with those who are around us. So there is a difference in the primary scope of those two laws that should not miss our judgment and discernment, because that's really important. I mean, that's a huge difference that exists between the two. Now, I said a moment ago, even within that law, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, there is another difference if you went and looked at it a little more closely. So if, for example, if you kill me in the Code of Hammurabi, then what is your payment supposed to be? What is the right judgment against you? You kill me, the court says, what? What happens? Eye for an eye, tooth for tooth. It's not hard. You kill me, you die. Now, let's look at a different circumstance, though. I kill your son. Now who dies, according to the Code of Hammurabi? My son. Is that the same as the law of God? Is that the same as the law of God? If I kill your son in the law of God, who dies? I do. Why? Son's not guilty of the sins of the father, and he's not going to be accountable for them. Now, we can look at instances in which, and I think when we do that, we need to be really careful because we don't know all the facts. There are instances in which a father sinned and his whole household pays. For example, give me one. First one comes to my mind is Achan. So there are instances like that. Do we know all the facts behind that? Do we know about the knowledge the family might have had about anything that was happening? No, we don't know anything about that. All we know in that circumstance that we look at and say, well, that doesn't seem consistent, what do we know? Who do we know is a more important question. Could be, and again, there is a distinction between consequences and ultimate accountability, correct? There is a difference between those two. But in the cases that we're talking about, is there a difference between the consequence, so to speak, and the accountability? Well, like I said, eye for an eye, tooth for tooth. If I kill somebody, if I kill your son, in the law of Moses, I die. Why? Because I'm guilty, and therefore I'm accountable, and I suffer the consequences. So all I'm saying is we can look at some of that, and in our minds there might be some inconsistency. So in those instances when we don't have all the facts and don't know everything that was going on, and it seems to be somewhat inconsistent with other parts of the law, what should we remember? We know who. We know the God who wrote the law. We know the God who keeps the law, right? And therefore we know that he always acts in righteous judgment. So whatever he did with Achan, it was just. I don't understand all the facts behind it, but whatever was done was just and was right and was consistent with what he tells us, how he tells us to act and how he tells us to live. So I'm comfortable with that because I don't know everything. And there are some things, frankly, that I can read about that I look at and I say, but what about this? And so I can look at some of those things in Scripture. But it goes back to that whole discussion we had before with regard to archaeology. Do archaeologists find everything that's out there? No. So there are things that we haven't found that the Bible speaks about. Does that mean the Bible doesn't know what it's talking about and those things didn't exist? No. And I'm content to give the Bible its due credit. It has more than earned the right to be trusted in the areas when I don't know something. And so again, God has earned the right, and I know that sounds almost ridiculous, but God has earned my trust in the areas in which I can't make complete sense out of everything that may transpire in Scripture. God has earned my trust to the point that I'm willing to, and content to say, I know him, and I know who I believe in, and I know that he always acts righteously. So instead of looking at it and saying, well, that doesn't seem right, I can look at it and say, well, that doesn't really make sense to me, but I know it's right. I know it's good. I know whatever he does is good. Is it Joy's got something?
Oh, no, I was just going to add earlier on when you were saying, what do we know? Not only is God just, because there are other people who can be just.
Yes.
He is perfectly just. He is
Yes.
never wrong.
Right. That's right. That's right. And I mean, he's perfect in every aspect of his being. So anyway, but that is a massive distinction, and again gets back to the point Taylor was making, in that there is an inherent difference in the scope between the law of Moses and the Code of Hammurabi. And that is really important. And if we're having these discussions with these people who are criticizing the Bible because it's similar to the Code of Hammurabi, then the hope is, as we listen to them talk about all of that and even agree with those similarities, there are similarities. There's no way to, there's no reason to deny that. So we listen contently to that and we agree, yes, there are similarities between the two. And we could even use some of the explanations that we've talked about in this class for why those might be similar. But I would suggest to you that that's not really the direction to go. Just agree that there are similarities. And then say, but can I show you some massive differences between the very nature of those laws and their focus that make this discussion turn on a whole different topic and are really important for why we ought to give greater consideration to the things written by Moses than the things written by Hammurabi. Because Moses wasn't primarily, and more importantly because we know it came from God, was not primarily concerned with economic equality or with leveling the stakes with regard to those kinds of things. And he wasn't even, when we talk about the idea of if I kill your son, then the court kills my son, wasn't looking at how do I give you the same kind of pain that you give me, which is what the Code of Hammurabi is doing. It's going to hurt you less if I kill you than it will if I kill your son. You're going to know my pain, so to speak, if we kill your son. But that's not the way that the law of God deals with it, because the law of God holds the person who sinned personally accountable and responsible. But there's still another point we haven't made yet that leads us back to the line that I didn't want to talk about, but is really important. And that is the real focus behind all of this law, even though, as Taylor said, there is a great difference between the fact that Hammurabi is primarily concerned with economic and rights equality, whereas the law of God is concerned with moral rightness. There is another point that's even more significant. Yes, sir. Okay. Everything about the law of Moses stems not from the worry about civil or economic or justice in a general sense at all. What was the purpose of the law? And this is seen in both the Old Testaments and New Testaments. It's quoted in the New. John.
The law was the tutor to bring them to Christ.
Whether we're talking about the law of Moses or the law of Christ, what was its purpose? Okay, be holy as I am holy. Was that the purpose of the law of Hammurabi? Was Hammurabi trying to make more of him? Really? Was he trying to make more of him? No. He was just trying to lead his people and make sure that they knew it. That I'm the one who gave you this law. I am the great Hammurabi king, and you're going to follow me. And you're going to do what I say because I care about you, and I want to protect you and provide for you. And so this is the way that is good and right for you to follow and to walk in. But God's law is written to make us holy as he himself is holy. And so it's not primarily concerned with justice at all or equality in any of those senses. It is primarily concerned with making us morally upright, which leads to justice, but to making us morally upright just as God himself is. Joe.
Take a look at it. The law of God, the law of Moses, was about love.
Yes.
Because everything rested upon love.
Yes.
The two commandments that everything else rested upon: love God with all your heart, love your neighbor as yourself.
That's right.
Everything else follows down below that.
That's right. And it's not, and just to be, just so we make everybody who's uncomfortable by Joe's love comment more comfortable, is that the ooey gooey, touchy feely kind of love that we're talking about primarily?